Hi folks, we're here for Middle English Literature and I want to go over our readings for the week. I'll give you as much of an overview as possible. Now, the C.S. Lewis reading can be very complicated. We've got the preface and two sections of the discarded image to go through. So I just want to go over conceptually what's going on. So most of you probably have not read the classical material that Lewis will refer to, or even the medieval material that Lewis will refer to. He'll occasionally he'll reference some things from Chaucer and maybe even Langland that we'll be reading in class, but most of the material that he refers to is material as continental medieval literature, right, on the continent, France and Italy and places like that, Spain. So in the discarded image, one of the things that Lewis tries to emphasize is that this is an overview, right? He's trying to introduce medieval literature to students who have not read all of that classical material. And after the preface, when we get into the medieval situation, Lewis talks about the kind of like the some of the assumptions about the universe that the medieval mind makes, and he says that there are a number of different ways to think about the medieval view, and he presents the savage view, uncivilized or primitive beliefs in early cultures and so on and so forth, and quickly debunks that, saying that the savage view doesn't have the kind of appeal to authority that the medieval reader would make. So they wouldn't make that kind of an appeal. So the medieval reader relies heavily on previous authority. As Lewis points out, if it's written in a book somewhere, probably the medieval author is going to just accept it as authoritative, that it was published or that it was written down means it went through some sort of process of scrutiny, and if the reader is wrong about the authority, that's on the authority, not on the reader. Now, whether we like it or not, that's just the situation that they're working in. Now, he points out also that the medieval view is also different from the savage view, is that it is in contact with other cultures. It's not an isolated, not like an isolated, the medieval situation is not like an isolated village somewhere. And it's also a literate culture. So there is still some orality, performance of poetry orally, but for the most part, it's literate. And by literate, I mean written in Latin. Now, there's also another layer that Lewis doesn't talk about so much, and that is vernacular. So Middle English is a vernacular language, meaning it's not Latin. It is the language of a people somewhere in a location who also have cultural contact with those outside of its location. But the literacy of medieval people is a Latinate literacy. So here are some of the observations that ancients make, which the medievals inherit. So Aristotle, for example, observes that there's change in nature, but there's no change in the heavens and the sky. The stars kind of roll around. I suppose if any of you are star watchers, you might be familiar with the movement of the stars, but their proximity or their relative locations to each other do not change. And so Aristotle makes that observation. And so rather than saying, oh, the earth below is characterized by change and the heavens above are characterized by fixation, he also recognizes that way up high in the air, there is also a kind of change with things like weather. And so Aristotle comes to the conclusion, I don't think that he made this up, but he might have been the one who perhaps talked about it most eloquently in the ancient period. So Aristotle's reasoning is that there are certain elements in nature: earth, water, air, and fire, and there must be a fifth element, a quintessence, that exists above fire. So if we go in levels, the earth is the densest and sinks to the bottom. Water sits on top of earth because it's less dense. The air sits on top of water because it's even less dense than that. And the flames in fire, so the flames are not the fire itself, but the flames in fire indicate the fire moves upward above the air itself. And so up, up above, maybe to the moon, the sphere of the moon, is where the fire goes. And beyond that is the quintessence, sometimes called ether or ether. Now, modern space travel and modern science has a more complex view of those things and would, might even dismiss the idea. Oh, I think they would dismiss the idea of an unchangeable cosmos, right? Astronomical observations have shown that there is change in the stars, but that's not. The medievals don't know that. They don't have that equipment. The classical era doesn't have that equipment. So they're still doing the scientific method. They're making observations, right? Looking out there. They're not just like inventing things from their own minds. They're making observations, and based on facts that they already have, they're drawing conclusions from it. So the medieval view inherits that. The medievals value authority, including church authority. So, I'm in the Reformed tradition. Many of my students are a mix of Catholics and Protestants and broadly evangelical students. So whatever our views may be on church authority, for the medieval reader, the church was the authority, and problems introduced by that are addressed by later writers like William Langland, and we're going to read Piers Plowman, for example, in this class. And Langland definitely has a problem with church authority, and he is, at least a century or two before the Reformation. So we have these proto-reformational authors, but they still see the church as having authority. Now, Lewis goes on to point out that the medieval period also has this tendency to categorize things. They love to put things in boxes. So my generation, maybe, I don't know, this may still be a thing. My generation was told to think outside of the box, to color, let your colors go outside the lines. The medieval person would say, why would you think outside of the box when you have a perfectly good box to put all your stuff in and then close it up and make sure it never touches anything else? So medievals, they enjoyed classifying things, they enjoyed listing things, putting things into categories, which also created some problems, like all categorizations do. What happens when views about a certain phenomenon or an animal or a plant or whatever change, then your categories are all messed up. And if you think that your categories are the first instance, then you've got a real problem. Fortunately, there have been thinkers throughout time that recognize the categories are actually derived from observations. Now, pause for a second. There are categories of metaphysical categories, things like truth and maybe even numbers and mathematics would fall under such a category. So there are these larger categories, immutable categories, but there are also categories that we create, and we need to be mindful of those differences. So the medievals also, they tend toward believing everything that they hear, for better or for worse. They do recognize incongruities also, which is why we get the scholastic theologians in the, let's say the 13th and 14th centuries, 12th, 13th, and 14th centuries, who are trying to reconcile what they see as apparent discrepancies, but believe on the basis of authority are actually reconcilable. And so sometimes scholastic theology comes up with some very unusual ways of seeing the world. Aquinas was probably the greatest scholastic theologian, and a reasonable theologian too. In fact, so I'm in the Reformed tradition. Although there are differences between Aquinas and Calvin, they're also, very, very similar in their assessments of doctrine and things like that. Of course, they would disagree on things like the Eucharist and the authority of the church and so forth, but they were reasonable thinkers. Now, other scholastics could maybe go off the deep end, and in fact, I would say that the Enlightenment is kind of a pushback against scholasticism. But that's the medieval situation. Now, Lewis also presents his reservations in the next chapter, and he says that so for theologians and natural philosophers, which we would call scientists, right? Natural philosophy is what we now call science. For theologians, philosophers, natural philosophers, they would hold on loosely to the things that they believed because by nature of their discipline, they understood that new information could change their perspective. Not that the truth would change, but new information would give a fuller understanding. Poets don't do that. Poets and artists often cling to a proclaimed belief, and because they're not experts, they don't scrutinize it, and they're not as open to change. So it's the poet who might dogmatically hold on to a proposition, whereas the theologian and the philosopher might say, well, now with this new information we can make some adjustments. Lewis also says that the medieval view it's an affective view. It has a kind of emotional, not emotional appeal. There is emotional appeal to it, but there's an emotional component to it that was important. Anselm of Canterbury, who is probably most famous for his ontological proof, God is that than which nothing greater can be thought. Anselm would go beyond that in the Proslogion, where he makes that statement. What follows in Proslogion is not a bunch of theology. I mean, there is some theology that follows, but what culminates Proslogion is an ecstatic devotional reaction. So there is this emotional component that we have to keep in mind for the Middle Ages. Lewis then points out the idea of saving appearances, the idea that you try and have an explanation for your world that accounts for as much as possible without introducing new complications into the model. That's called saving appearances. So, again, the medievals, they didn't have the same kinds of technologies that we have, but they were still observant, right? They were still human beings with powers of observation and reason like we have, and did pretty well with the information that they had. Now, they also understood that maybe the... well, I'm looking at my notes now. I think I'm about ready to make a point that I already made. The difference between the science and poets. But there is also there's a modern application, and Lewis is actually driving toward this end in Discarded Image. So when we get near the end of the book, we'll see this more brought up more by Lewis. So one of the things to keep in mind is that every period of time, every epoch, however we want to divide and classify time, has a backdrop against which its beliefs are held, including our own. So in our modern time, one of the backdrops, one of the pieces of the tapestry that we don't think about is the influence of the theory of evolution. Now, you may say, oh no, I'm opposed to it, I think about it often. That's not what I'm talking about. I'm talking about the influence it had on seeing things that are older as simpler or less refined, less informed, and seeing newer things as being more informed or more truthful. That is a silent influence of Darwinian evolution that has really pronounced for us, oh, the old-time people just didn't know as much and the new-time people know more. We don't think about it, we don't scrutinize it. It's not because we're being malicious, that's just the way, it's our backdrop that we're working with. So Lewis will work toward that end in The Discarded Image. Now, as far as medieval literature goes, so in the preface and introduction to Middle English literature, uh, you'll see a lot of history and development of the Middle English language. So, for our purposes, Middle English literature is from 1066, the Norman Conquest, till about 1500, where the Norman language is introduced and highly influences the development of English. There are other language groups like Norse language groups and Celtic language groups that influence English literature too, but the big one is the Norman Conquest. Uh, there, most medieval literature, not just Middle English literature, is religious in nature. It's a very Christian era. I know people have called it the Dark Ages. I think Petrarch famously referred to it as the Dark Ages. But it is it's actually quite a bright age. Some of the, artistry and feats of engineering, greatest feats of engineering done by man were done during the Middle Ages. Think about the Flying Buttress and some of the illuminated manuscripts that were produced in the British Isles. So much of that, almost all of that, was in the service of Christianity, in the service of the church. And people were quite biblically literate. Now, I'm not saying that they had Bibles in their homes that they were reading, but they were hearing sermons often, and even if they were listening to the Mass in Latin or the readings in Latin, they would still have a lot of helps around to understand the stories of the Bible. So they weren't. I don't want to oversell the idea that there was this biblical ignorance in the Middle Ages. I also don't want to go too far and say that there was the kind of widespread knowledge about the Bible that we have now. There probably wasn't, but it wasn't as dark as people think it was. Our selections will reflect that, right? Most of our readings will be religious readings or connect to religious topics, Christian topics, not just generally religious, but Christian. There are a couple that might kind of stray outside. Look at the pronunciation guide. For better or for worse, I'm not a stickler on pronunciation, but you can find pronunciation guides online. On YouTube, you can find people reading in Middle English what they believe the pronunciation was. My Middle English dialects professor, even though he had very definite thoughts on pronunciation, didn't emphasize it that much, and so I don't emphasize it in turn. All right.